Okay, welcome back to Introduction to Financial Services Industry. This video is going to focus on just providing a really high-level introduction to settlement. What is settlement all about? Because in a lot of these presentations I've talked about, I've referred to settlement, but here I'm going to talk a little bit more directly about it. And again, this is for a novice presentation. If you are a expert looking for expert information, refer to other materials such as the book After the Trade is Made. And all the information here is publicly available, and I'm not going to offer any advice. So what is settlement? So first of all, when you buy a house, right, you go through a process of the closing, right? And during the closing, you come to the lawyer's office, the buyer's there, the seller's there, and you sign a lot of papers, and the money moves into escrow, and the money moves here, and the money moves there. But at the end, when all the money is in the right place, they give you the keys to the house, and you sign all the papers, and you walk out the door, and you've got your mortgage, and you bought the house. The deal is closed. So if you go back to the house and you find that there's an issue or there's a problem, you really can't go back too much and fight it, because the deal is closed. The deal is settled. The same thing with the example I gave in one of the first videos where I talked about going to McDonald's and placing your order. When you place your order and they fill your order and they give you the food, you pay the bill, and you take your tray and you walk away, you really can't come back like an hour later and say, hey, I'm missing my French fries. I guess you could. You can challenge it, but the deal is settled. The deal is closed. So in the securities industry, we have the same concept. You're buying and selling assets. At some point, the assets have to settle. Now, we'll talk about settlement. Okay, settlement is the completion of a transaction where the seller transfers the securities or financial instruments to the buyer, and the buyer transmits the money to the seller. A settlement may be final or provisional. So it is true that it isn't always completely settled. It could be provisional or it could be final. It depends on the market, it depends on the product. But the idea of settlement is the buyer delivers the asset, the buyer delivers the cash to make the purchase, the seller delivers the asset, both things match, transaction gets blessed and completed, and then you move on to the next transaction. A settlement is an act that discharges obligations in respect to funds and security transfers between two or more parties. A discharge of an obligation by a transfer of funds and a transfer of securities that have become irrevocable and unconditional. And there's the settlement's final, right? Once you sold the securities and you deliver the securities and everything's done, the transaction is completed. So you might sell a security to someone and receive cash, and someone then may sell that security to somebody else. The transaction that you executed was completed and ended. It was settled. So that's settlement. Now, in order to make this process efficient in markets, we have custodians. And we talked about this in an earlier slide, talking about what's the role of the custodian bank, or if it's international trade, a global custodians. And the custodian bank, their job is to safekeep and hold the securities on behalf of the brokers, on behalf of the clients. So your broker is going to have a custodian bank that's going to hold and safekeep your securities. And then when the securities are sold, the custodians can be instructed to deliver them. If you purchase securities, custodians can be instructed to expect that the securities you purchased will be delivered into that firm. So the custodian's job is to be the safekeeper for the movement of cash and securities. The depository we talked about in an earlier presentation. Depositories, there are depositories in some markets, in many markets. In the US market, we use depositories. The depository usually refers to a place where something is deposited for storage or security purposes. Typically, this is for the purpose of settling the transaction. You know, think about it. Think about it as the place where you escrow the asset or the cash while you're processing the security, the trade, the transaction. That's kind of the job of the depository. So central security depositories allow brokers and other financial companies to deposit securities where book entry and other services can be performed. Likewise, like clearance, settlement, and security borrowing and lending. So we didn't really talk about security borrowing and lending, but that's the case. That's the use of the depository. And the clearing corporations is an organization associated with an exchange to handle the confirmation, settlement, and delivery of transactions, right? Fulfilling the main obligation of ensuring the transactions are made in a prompt and efficient manner. They were also referred to as clearing firms. That's really the important thing. The clearing corporations are central to the idea of settlement. And there's a Canadian depository we talked about, the OCC, the Option Clearing Corporation, the DTC, we talked about DTCC, and NSCC, which is the clearing arm of DTCC. So I'm going to go through this example. I know you've probably seen it in earlier presentations, but when we talk about settlement, this is a good example, I think. You've got broker green and broker red, and at the end of the day, they net out all their trades. They get their reports back from the depository, the clearing corporations. They get their reports from their exchanges. They net it out, and they're told. They're instructed on what cash has to move and what security has to move. So broker green sees that he's got to move certain cash to the depository to settle the trades. So he instructs his custodian to move the cash. Broker red has after he's netted everything down, determines that he has a certain number of shares he's been instructed that he has to be delivered to the depository. So he's going to instruct his custodian to deliver those shares. So both broker green and broker red instruct their custodians. Green is sending cash, red sends shares. Now the clearing corporation, as we talked about earlier, gets all the information from the exchanges and collects all the data, nets everything out, and talks to the depository. And basically, now if at this point, if brokers still owe cash or they still owe securities, they can be notified that, hey, they're short on what they've been owed to put in their box. But let's assume that everything is correct. Clearing corporation, once it sees everything is correct, they're going to notify the depositories the trade is cleared for settlement. So everything's ready for settlement. So depository now the trades are going to settle, is going to release the shares and release the cash. So the shares will move to the broker that it has shares pending into their account, and the cash will move to the custodian, the broker who's owed the cash. And then at this point, all the brokers have received the correct cash and shares on their buys and sells have been netted down, and the trades are ready for the trades are settled. This trade is now settled. Now we talk about T and T+1 and T+2. T is the trade date, the date the trade executed. A notice of execution produced and the trade executed. That's T. And then the +1 is, or +2 or +3 is how many days after the trade date, how many business days do you have to complete this whole process? So this process of netting everything down, instructing the custodians, moving the cash and the securities to the depository, having the clear corporation validate everything, and then release it for settlement. That's how many days you have. So in the US equity market, in most cases, we're talking about T+2, right? Different products have different times. There are markets in the world that are T+1. I think Korea and a couple of places are actually T+0. Everything settles on the same day. But it takes in the US market several days for this whole process to complete for most products, for equity products and some other products. But and years ago it was T+5. So we've actually improved the market. So T is the trade date, and then the plus number is how many days you have to complete settlement. If you don't complete the settlement, if the cash or securities have not been delivered to the depository in that number of days, then the trade would fail, and then you would be liable for fines or penalties from the regulators or from the depositories, the exchange, or whoever. So that's T and T+1, 2, 2, and 3. Eventually in the US, we're moving towards a T+1 market where the trades you do today will settle tomorrow. We're not there yet, right? Not there yet. But for most equity products, we're generally today looking at T+2, T+3. Depends upon the product. Bonds are different than equities, are different than, different products have different time periods. This again is a chart that I borrowed this from the DTCC website, but it's the same thing. It shows how all the trades get netted down. The NSCC, which is under the DTCC, which is the National Securities Clearing Corporation, they notify all the brokers on, who your firm owes cash or your firm owes securities to be deposited with your at the depository. The firms have to then move the assets to the depository, which then will eventually get on settlement, will then be released if everything matches up, and the money and the shares then move. So so getting settled again, clearance and settlement is basically a 3-step process. Shares bought must equal shares sold. Money paid must equal money received. Shares and money must move. That's a simplified view of settlement. When that process completes, you then settled. Now, international settlement. We've talked a lot about settlement in the US market. Let's talk briefly about international settlement. International settlement is also sometimes called cross-border settlement because it involves a transaction that sits in two different organizations, two different states, countries. So trade between counterparties located in different countries. That's cross-border settlement. Settlement that takes place in a country other than the country where the trade counterparty or both are located, right? Now, global custodians, global banks, this is Bank Paribas, Citibank, Credit Lyonnais, these are all examples of what's the other French one? Well, there's lots of global banks that provide global custodian services. Now, a custodian that provides customers with custody services with respect to securities traded and settled not only in the country in which the custodian is located, but also in numerous other countries. So global custodians are bank custodians that have presence in these other markets. Citibank, for instance, so you might have a relation, a broker might have a relation with Citibank and use Citi in Tokyo as a global custodian. So how is international settlement different than US settlement? How is this cross-border settlement different? difference between the U.S. Settlement and international settlement processing, right? So in the U.S., as I said, we have the DTC, which, by the way, DTC also covers some Canadian securities, some Canadian trades. So in the US, we do everything through DTCC. Outside the US, for these cross-border trades, global custodian banks often provide for some of the same settlement facilitation because they're involved with and they know those local markets. They're experts in the local markets for settlement. Settlement can be complicated by the fact that it becomes multi-currency. So if you have a US customer who has an account that's all in dollars and they're trying to settle the purchase of a bond in Tokyo, there's almost an either the client has to have a separate account that holds yen, or there has to be an FX transaction so that they can take dollars and buy yen in order to settle in the local market. So that adds a level of complexity. So that's a piece, multi-currency for the settlement currency. That's something that's very different when you have these cross-border where the customer is sitting in one nation and the settlement is occurring in another. Local laws and regulations in international markets differ from those in the US. So this is where a broker is going to have relationships with local brokers, local global custodians that know those local markets and can help navigate the local rules, stamp duty, taxes, and other regulatory aspects. The US has specific laws regulating and governing international trade. So anytime you're sitting in the US, you're doing international transactions, there are specific laws that cover that. Now, one example here is what's called the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's a specific organization, specific group that brokers work with that's to provide oversight to any foreign trades, any foreign transactions. And as you probably know from the other video I have out there, there are certain countries that are strictly regulated, right? You know, you can't sit in the United States and do a securities transaction, a financial transaction with North Korea, with with Cuba, for example. So there's certain countries, Iran, that have special regulatory oversight when doing financial transactions with them from the US. The other thing is holidays are different, right? So if you're doing these transactions, and we're looking at T+1, there are dates that could be a holiday in the US, but won't be a holiday in that local market. So you have to be sensitive to the holidays in the local markets. Is it a settlement day in that market? Is it a trade date in that market? Are the banks open in that local market? Can you move securities? And again, as I mentioned earlier, other markets might have different trade cycles, right? So for settlement, they might be. I think Korea, South Korea is T+0, and I think Australia, I think they're T+1. But different countries have different cycles for how long you have to complete the settlement process. That could be different than the process cycle you're doing in the US. So these are all things that make it more complicated when you're doing this sort of cross-border transactions, these international transactions, where the client and the broker sits here in the United States and you're executing trades and settling them for products outside the United States. Also, client accounts need to be specifically approved and enabled for international trading. So what does the future look like, right? Now, this is where I throw my own opinions. In the future, there's going to be more international. The idea of trading only with clients will only trade with the U.S. market, I think is going to start fading away. More and more, we're going to see more and more of these cross-border trades. More and more times, we're going to have U.S. clients wanting to buy foreign securities. We're going to have people outside the United States buying U.S. securities, which they do today, but they do it by opening accounts in the U.S. But more and more, I think you're going to see that all breaking down, that it's going to be much more fluid with a lot more cross-border international trades having to settle. That's all I wanted to say on settlement, both U.S. settlement and international settlement. I know that was quick. If you have any questions, please send me your email at with your question at the following address, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. And thank you. Have a nice day.